So, what is a positive destination? So when we're looking at education in Scotland, we talk about these positive destinations, and all we really mean is where students go after school, and not in a physical or geographical sense. We're talking about whether basically they end up in education, training, or employment. And if they do, we call it a positive destination. And if they don't achieve a positive destination. Fairly simple, and actually quite an important metric for education, because school's not an end in itself, and we do hopefully want to be sending the students on to this next step. So it does make sense for us to take a bit of time and look at it and figure out, is that really what's happening? So the data essentially just tries to ask that question, okay, but what happened next? And we actually check it twice. We check it 3 months after they leave school, and we check it again for what's called follow-up destination data about 9 months after they leave school. So the most recent headline figures for 2022, the initial destinations, when we checked it 3 months in, more than 95% achieving positive destinations, more than 40% in higher education, about a quarter in further education, about a quarter in employment, and the rest either in recognised training programmes, volunteering schemes, or skill development work. All nice and simple. When you then look at the follow-up information for that same cohort, which as I say was taken 6 months later, you see a bit of a swing towards those in employment as opposed to those in education, but that's normal. It's fairly standard actually, especially in colleges where students might start a course and then get a job offer, sometimes for the very thing that they are actually studying towards, and decide it's too good to pass up, so off they go. So that's fairly standard. What is maybe worth noticing this year is there's been a slight increase in the dropout rate at higher education, which post-pandemic is worth keeping an eye on. But the overall decline from positive destinations and that follow-up data is, to be honest, relatively normal. There's always a slight slip between the initial data and the follow-up data. But overall, it all looks relatively good on the face of it. Even in the follow-up data, the later check, 93.5% of 2022 leavers were in positive destinations. So as I say, 9 months after they've left school. And that's a very clear and major improvement on the 2010 figure, which was down at like 86%. We can see, for example, if we look across the board, an increase in overall higher education access over the years. Again, bearing in mind that, noticeable drop in the most recent year. What we can also see though is that in further education, the situation is different. So if we ignore 2021, when we're still dealing with, the effects of the pandemic, the most recent figure for students going into further education after school is actually the lowest in the records that we have, which go back to 2010. There's also a clear shift in the profile in terms of employment in that period as well. So in 2010, less than a quarter of school leavers were going into employment. In 2022, that figure was nearly a third. In terms of when we get into the data as well, what else can we see? Well, one of the things is it comes with various breakdowns. So we can look at this destination data and we can break it down by ethnicity, disability status, additional support needs, and even where people live, whether they live in urban or rural areas. So we know, for example, that 29% of school leavers from what we call remote small towns went into higher education, but the figure for those from large urban areas, i.e. Scotland cities, well, that was 41%. That's a major, major difference. We can see as well, for example, that the lowest figure for positive destinations in the follow-up data is amongst those with a disability, where the figure is 89.2% as opposed to 93.6% for those without a disability. Not a massive difference, but a definite difference. We also get the data broken down by deprivation, and there we see some fairly interesting things. So, for example, nearly 60% of the richest fifth of Scotland's school leavers every year go into higher education. That's more than double the figure for those from the poorest backgrounds. And yes, that figure from those from the poorest backgrounds has come up, but the disparity is still very, very, very striking. Indeed, for that poorest fifth, the most common destination after school isn't university or college, it's employment. But there are also problems with the data itself. It only really sits at that kind of headline level of the kind of things that I've given you a taste of so far, and it lacks a lot of specific detail that we could really do with. And what that means is that although the data continues to improve, it is possible that there are issues in there that are being hidden. Now, the most obvious example is in the employment data, because we don't get told anything about wages or about the quality of the work that's going on, and surprisingly to many people, the Scottish Government counts 0 hours contracts in that. So a 0 hours contract job counts as a positive employment destination after school. And that's despite the fact that the government is very critical of 0 hours contracts, and the SNP members have referred to them as exploitative. So there's a clear issue in the employment data. There's also an issue in the higher education data, and it's quite technical, but it is important because many people in this country assume that higher education is the same thing as university and that further education is college. But that's not the case in Scotland. In Scotland, colleges deliver more than 10% of the higher education that takes place. About 15% of college students are doing higher education, most of it through HNCs and HNDs. But there's almost certainly going to be a divide in the type of pupils who go to do higher education at university and the type of pupils who go to do their higher education at college. And we should know those differences. We should be able to see in the data whether or not, say, for example, significantly less affluent pupils are finding that their increased access to higher education is not actually coming in university. Now, that might be something that's justifiable, but it is something that people should be aware of. Maybe the biggest issue, though, with positive destinations data is actually just the success of it. We're at the stage where now the overwhelming majority reach positive destinations. Changes that take place every year, at most, we're talking a couple of percentage points. Sometimes it's less than that. So have we perhaps reached the stage where the data isn't really all that useful anymore, and where perhaps it's time for us to try to develop something a bit more detailed, a bit more powerful, and also maybe a bit more honest about the reality for Scotland's school leavers?